But check it out. Let me give a little introduction to the class. When I knew we were going to be in Genesis, because we're doing this sermon series, the story, it's always a good time to talk about things related to origins, I think. But at the same time, it's not necessarily going to be a whole sermon, probably. These two classes are a wonderful way to talk about some things that naturally arise out of the Genesis 1, 2, 3, and really the biblical narrative, relating to things that are probably in most adults' minds in relation to origins. Who we are, where we came from, what sort of mainstream science says and doesn't say about this, all those types of things. And in any class, you can never cover everything. We all know that. So this class will be no exception. We're not going to be covering everything there is to cover about every issue of this. However, I wanted to give Christians, especially, and people thinking through this issue, some meat in this area to ponder. What does the text say about origins? What are we able to derive out of the Bible itself? And then how should that affect, dominate, permeate, influence, control what we think and don't think about really these historical questions of life on earth and all of that. And I said, man, I've got these really awesome guys that I've heard do this before. I think I'm going to ask my buds instead to do this class. And so I called up my friend James Umber and my friend Marty Clapp, and they said they would come. And so I'm going to kind of hand the mic over them in a second. And so I encourage you guys, grab a Bible if you can when you're done eating, and kind of look around, poke around, see what we're talking about, what we're not talking about. And I encourage you to check this class out. I think you will enjoy it. So James, with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to you. Give it up for my main man, James Umber, if you could. I think he'll serve us well, Marty, in this area. I think you'll enjoy what they have to say and the way they say it. So thanks, James, for being with us today.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, VOCAB. Well, welcome. My name is James, like VOCAB said, and right there in the white shirt is my friend Marty. And we actually run an apologetics ministry at our church, and we speak at other churches, but mainly at our home church of Chandler Christian. So we're happy to be here. Today we're going to be talking about the theory of evolution for the most part, namely the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. So that's the typical version of evolution, the standard theory that you hear in the high school and college campuses, and how that compares or relates to the Genesis account, the Genesis creation account, and the rest of the Bible, really. Now, when we have a commitment to two different ideas, and we find a conflict between those two ideas, usually our first impulse is to try to integrate the two, to try to reconcile the two. In fact, us men in the room are really good at this. You know, you may have a guy who's committed to watching football, right? And so he's sitting down one evening, he's watching football, and his wife says, hey, honey, can you turn off the game, come into the dining room, we're all going to have dinner as a family, right? Now, there's clearly a conflict between his two commitments here. This is going to be a problem. But it's no problem for the guy, because he's going to integrate the two commitments. He just walks over to the TV, unplugs it, carries it into the dining room, plugs it back in, it's all set. He's integrated his two commitments, sort of. Well, I think that many Christians have done the same thing with the theory of evolution. They have a commitment to Christianity, but at the same time they have a commitment to the theory of evolution. Now, when I say evolution, like I said, the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, basically that means the idea, the theory, that life began on Earth billions of years ago. Then that first life then changed or evolved into all the organisms on Earth today through the process of mutation and natural selection. Now, a Christian, there are many different reasons why a Christian may have a commitment to the theory of evolution. Maybe they were taught that evolution is a fact. Maybe they're aware of the fact that about 99% of scientists around the world are, at least seem to be evolutionists. Seems pretty clear. Maybe they just don't want to appear unreasonable. Certainly, questioning or disbelieving in the theory of evolution is an easy way to appear unreasonable in our society. Maybe they themselves are a scientist and they don't want to be marginalized by the establishment view, those who hold to the establishment view of Neo-Darwinian evolution. Or it may be, and I've met people like this, it may very well be the case that they have looked at the evidence. Maybe they have looked at some of the evidence for and against evolution, and they sincerely think that the evidence conclusively proves evolution. I think that that does happen. Of course, I'd want to talk to them about that evidence and have some questions for them, but I think that this does happen. So they end up trying to integrate Christianity with the theory of evolution. Now, Marty and I actually think that the scientific evidence really needs to be dealt with first before you deal with the issue of how this works with the text of the Bible. Because imagine that someone comes up to you and says, hey, listen, I've found a way to integrate a theory of a flat earth with the text of the Bible. Let me show you some verses that are compatible with a flat earth theory. I think you'd tend to say, well, let's look at the science first and see if there's any reason to even try to integrate this theory with the text of the Bible. Now, we humbly submit that integrating the theory of evolution with the text of the Bible is very much the same. And I know that's a bold claim, but really, discoveries within the last 50 years, and especially within the last 15 years, have torn huge holes in the theory of evolution. So we would suggest dealing with the scientific evidence for and against the theory first to see if there's any reason to even bother trying to integrate it with the text of the Bible. But assuming that you've already dealt with the scientific evidence, you've already researched the evidence for and against, or you've already talked about it, still there are questions that remain. Textual questions. Questions of a hermeneutical, exegetical nature. Basically, does the text of the Bible fit with the theory of evolution? What does it teach? What does it not teach? How do we interpret it? So let's take a look at some of these textual concerns. Now, a person who integrates the theory of evolution with Christianity would fall under the broad category of a theistic evolutionist. That's the broad term. Now, various Christians who hold to evolution have different names that they've coined to describe their position. Each one, sometimes they all have different names. So I think just for our purposes here today, we're going to use the broad term theistic evolution, especially since we're going to be talking about it in general here today. But theistic evolutionists often try to integrate the theory with the text in one of two ways. For the most part, they fit into one of two categories. Either they say that the creation account in Genesis is metaphorical or allegorical, or a representation in one way or another of a true general idea, but that the details are not accurate. Or they say that the creation account is a myth. It's mythological, but that God uses man-made myth to communicate a true general idea, but again, the details are not accurate. And I think both of these approaches suffer from much the same problem. You see, Christianity is anchored in an historical event. Like Paul said, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, we are, of all men, most to be pitied. But if the historical accuracy of the Bible doesn't start in the book of Genesis, where does it begin? But even within the book of Genesis, even if we just look at the book of Genesis, it contains many foundational historical events that even Jesus and Paul, in fact, other New Testament writers, seem to think were real historical events, accurate historical events. Events like the flood, the Tower of Babel, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. In fact, even the Abrahamic covenant, which we talked about earlier in the service, we touched on it at least, even the Abrahamic covenant is in Genesis. Now that establishes the very purpose of the nation of Israel. So these are not trivial things that are discussed in Genesis. But if the historical accuracy of the book of Genesis doesn't begin with the first verse, where does it begin? Now, I think the way that most, or at least many, theistic evolutionists would answer that question, where does the historical accuracy begin in Genesis? The way most would, or at least many would answer that question, is they would say it begins in Genesis when the genre changes in Genesis. The historical accuracy begins when the genre changes in the book of Genesis. And they basically point out that in the book of Genesis, they say that there are at least two different genres. Early on in Genesis, you have poetry or poetic text, and then later in the book of Genesis, you have historical narrative. So it draws a line through the book of Genesis and says anything before this point is poetic, everything after this point is historical narrative. And they usually justify this division by pointing out that Genesis 1 is very rhythmic. That's true. I mean, they have a point there. Genesis 1 is very rhythmic. But then again, so is the Pauline Creed in 1 Corinthians 15. This is the one that says, "For I deliver to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12." Now that's very rhythmic. But are we supposed to understand from the fact that it's rhythmic that the author did not intend for us to take that as historically accurate? Historically detailed? I don't think that's proper to jump to that conclusion just because it's rhythmic. In fact, many modern New Testament scholars actually have come to the opposite conclusion. Because it's very rhythmic, they think that this is one of the oldest statements in the New Testament that goes back to soon after the crucifixion and resurrection. Because it's rhythmic, it appears to be a part of an early creed soon after the crucifixion and resurrection. In fact, how many people have heard of Jamie Solis? He's a children's songwriter. How many people? Okay. And he writes these amazing songs that help children memorize biblical history. It's incredible. Now, his songs, of course, are very rhythmic. In fact, it's that strong rhythm that helps children memorize the text. One of his most popular songs is called The Kings of Israel. And he goes through the entire succession of the kings of Israel in these songs, and children memorize these lyrics very quickly, and all of a sudden your children know the entire succession of the kings of Israel. In fact, it even gives details about each one of the kings. Now, it's the fact that it's rhythmic that makes it easy to memorize. It makes it a good vehicle for learning real history. A better example is the genealogies of Jesus. We see the genealogy from Joseph's side in Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 38. Now, this is very rhythmic. It says, Jesus, the son of Joseph, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, all the way down to the son of David, the son of Jesse, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, all the way down to the son of Abraham, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, all the way down to the son of Adam. Now, that's very rhythmic. But are we supposed to understand from that Luke did not intend this to be real history, detailed history? No. Clearly, the entire purpose of putting it in there is because he thinks that this is historical. And this is a part of God's Word. In fact, here's another question that arises from this. At what point does this go from historical to myth? Or historical to allegory? This is a succession, a genealogical succession that mentions Joseph. Is he historical? Well, yeah, I think we would all agree with that. What about David, King David? What about Jesse? What about Abraham? Well, it goes all the way back to Adam, who's established in Genesis chapter 1. Where do we draw that line and say, at this point, it becomes allegory in the book of Luke? So rhythm alone is not enough to say that a text was not intended to be taken as historically accurate. It's not enough to say that it's poetry, much less that it wasn't intended to be taken as accurate. You're going to need a much more detailed study in order to determine the genre, and even more important, you're going to need a much more detailed study to determine the intent of the author. And in fact, such a study has been done. I brought with me a book called Rate Volume 2, and in the last chapter, Dr. Stephen Boyd does an incredible statistical analysis of the verb forms in Genesis and compares it, especially in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, and then compares that to ancient Hebraic writing, and in fact even does a statistical analysis with the many other books in the Old Testament. And what he finds is that Genesis very clearly was intended to be taken as historical narrative from the first verse, not allegory. But let's look at some of the particulars of the Genesis account. Now, in this creation account, it says that God created different plant and animal kinds, and that each of these kinds only reproduces after its kind. Now, we're not exactly sure what a kind is. We're not sure how broad that category is. Maybe it's roughly equal to our modern taxonomical category of genus, I think, roughly in there maybe. But that's a modern taxonomical system. We're not exactly sure what a kind is, but this much is clear. This much is obvious when you read the passage. At the very least, Genesis specifies that plants, birds, fish, land animals, and humans are all separate creations that only reproduce after their kind. So that means plants only reproduce plants, fish only reproduce fish, birds only reproduce birds, land animals only reproduce land animals, and humans only reproduce humans. So if evolution is true, Genesis got it wrong. Now let's look at another particular. This is the figures, the personalities of Adam and Eve. Now in evolutionary theory, the line between our primate ancestors and us is a very blurry line. In fact, there is no clear beginning to humanity. Since evolution occurs over gradual, nearly imperceptible changes, the change from our primate ancestors to humans actually ends up occurring over a period of about 250,000 generations. The transition from primate ancestors, basically animals, to humans occurs over about 250,000 generations. So the origin of humanity is lost in an incomprehensible number of intermediates. It's kind of like my hair. Now, how many people here would say, I have a full head of hair? Okay, I have no friends in the room. Thanks. No. Be brutally honest. It's okay. Yeah, thank you. No, be brutally honest. It's okay. I have to accept reality at some point. To be honest with you guys, about the last time I had a full head of hair was about 15 years ago. Okay, so this has been happening for some time. Now, how many people here would say that I am bald? Okay, thank you. That's a little bit more generous. I appreciate that. No, I'm certainly going bald. That much is obvious. You know, if you want me to, there you go. You can see the reflection. Okay, that much is obvious. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I wanted to embarrass myself. No, the reason I bring this up is because talking about the first two humans is like talking about the day I went bald. It doesn't make any sense for me to talk about the day I went bald. I mean, thank goodness it doesn't happen that way. That would freak me right out. Could you imagine waking up in the morning, you wash your face, and you look in the mirror, what in the world happened? You know, I shouldn't have been playing with that plutonium. No, I don't know. You know, and you go into work, and everyone's like, what happened to you? Went bald last night. It's been a rough night, you know, rough day. Anyway, no, good thing it doesn't happen that way. But talking about the first two humans is talking about the day I went bald. It just doesn't make any sense. In fact, cladistics is a branch of evolutionary theory. And in cladistics, they describe humans as a type of fish. They describe humans as a type of fish because the distinction between us and our fish ancestors is simply a matter of successive slight modifications. We're just a modified version of a fish in evolutionary theory. So in evolutionary theory, I think it's fair to say there is no Adam and Eve. In fact, many theistic evolutionists come to that same conclusion. There is no historical Adam and Eve. Instead, Adam and Eve are replaced with a population spanning hundreds of thousands of generations. But you see, this destroys the very foundation of the gospel message. And I really can't make this point any better than famed atheist Dr. Frank Zindler did in 1993. Here's what he said, quote, "The most devastating thing, though, that biology did to Christianity was the discovery of biological evolution. Now that we know that Adam and Eve were never real people, the central myth of Christianity is destroyed. If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. If there never was an original sin, there's no need of salvation. And if there's no need of salvation, there's no need of a Savior. And I submit that that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed. I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity." Thank you, Dr. Zindler, for making my point. Now, we're going to look at another particular, the chronology in the book of Genesis, and Marty's going to help me out there with that.
So I want to take just a couple minutes, and I'll go through this fairly quickly to leave plenty of time for Q&A, but I want to just sort of give you a brief summary of the creation days that we see in Genesis. And as we look at these creation days, and I want you to think about the chronology that we see that unfolds during those creation days, and I want to sort of compare that chronology with the history, the chronological order as it's given by evolutionary theory. So I'll just go through this rather quickly. On day one, we see that the earth was created before the sun. Evolution says that the sun came before the earth. Genesis tells us that the earth was created covered with water, and so the oceans dominated on the earth until dry land eventually appeared. Evolution says just the opposite. It says that the earth started as a molten blob that broke away from the sun, and over millions of years it eventually cooled down. And so in that scenario, you have a planet where water isn't even going to appear for millions of years of its history. Day two, Genesis tells us that the atmosphere was created. That God separated the waters above from the waters below, and this resulted in the atmosphere. And it certainly suggests that right from the start, as God created the atmosphere, it was created it was intended to be inhabited with life, to support life. Now, as we look at life today, obviously plant, animal, humans, we need oxygen. And there's really no reason to think that life in the past was any differently as far as its requirements, that it would need oxygen as well. And the reason I bring that up is because this would suggest that the early atmosphere contained oxygen, that it was ready for life, created for life. But in comparison to that, evolution says just the opposite. It said that the early atmosphere did not have oxygen. It was comprised of methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. Clearly would not sustain life. So these are very, very different. Day three, Genesis tells us the dry land appears. And it tells us that the first life that appears on land, not only appears first on land, but that the first life that appears is plant life. And it tells us that that plant life was for the intent of providing food source for the humans and animals that were soon to follow afterward. So here Genesis is telling us that chronologically the life starts on land. Evolution, in contrast to that, says that no, it said it did not start on land. It started in the oceans as microscopic life. On day four, Genesis tells us that the sun, moon, and the stars were created. And so if you think in chronology, it was created after the earth, which was created on day one. The following verses also make it really clear. God has made it really clear that there were very specific purposes for the heavenly bodies that He created. Purposes that would include a continuation of the day and night cycle that had already been established. That it would provide light for the inhabitants here on earth. That they would provide a system and a means by which we would keep track of time, to mark seasons and days and years, to mark time. And ultimately, above everything else, that these heavenly bodies were created so that they would glorify God, so that we would experience these and glorify God in the process. And that's important. Again, because when you contrast that with evolution, it said that the sun and the stars came billions of years before the earth came into existence. So that you got this tremendous time span difference. And if you think about that, it would mean that for about 10 to 15 billion years of earth history, it would mean that the heavenly bodies were not in any way serving the purpose for which God said that they were created. So you have this unimaginable span of time of 10 to 14 or 10 to 15 billion years of earth history where nobody is present to experience these day and night cycles. Nobody is present to benefit from the light source that they're giving as God purposed them. Nobody is here to mark time or to look at these heavenly bodies, to track seasons or days or years, to mark history or to mark time. And most importantly, this purposive act of a creator to put these heavenly bodies to bring glory, to glorify Himself, then for all that span of time there would be no one here to see them, to experience them, to glorify God as He has manifested that glory. Nobody would be here to experience that. So day 5 in Genesis, the chronology tells us that sea creatures and birds were created, and this tells us that they were living at the same time. And in contrast to that, evolution says that fish evolved millions of years before birds appeared. So it's very, very different. Day 6 says that land creatures were created along with the first man and woman. So they were living contemporaneously. They were living at the same time. But even though they were created on that same day and at that same time, God makes it very clear that they were radically different from the animals that He had created, that they were unique, that they were distinct from everything else that he had created. Some of these differences were that man and woman were given dominion over the animals. This clearly set them apart from the animal kingdom. And they were created as God's image bearers, which made them unique and different from everything else he created. And then we find out later in Scripture, in Isaiah and in 1 John 4:9, it tells us that furthermore, two other things that really make mankind distinct as God's creation from the animals is that it says that man is the purpose of God's plan of salvation, and that he was the purpose of the very mission of God sending his Son into the world. In contrast to that, and I'll close with this, evolution gives us a very, very different, radical, different view of man. So rather than living contemporaneously with the animals, evolution puts man as a long descendant of the animals. Several billion years later, or several million years later, but the point is that man becomes just an afterthought. He just becomes an afterthought in the overall chronology, the overall history of the universe. So if you have a universe, if you kind of think about it this way, if we were to create a timeline of the biblical history as it's laid out for us in Genesis, you would see a timeline that begins from the very beginning to the present. You have mankind living right at the beginning and living throughout that timeline to the very present, always being present throughout the earth history, always being present throughout history. When you contrast that with an evolutionary timeline, it would be like drawing a stripe from the west coast of the United States and drawing that line clear across to the east coast of the United States. And then imagine yourself at the end of that. You're there on the east coast and you pull out a Sharpie pen and you reach out there and you put a little dot at the end of the timeline, and that's where we are in an evolutionary time scale. Just as I say, just sort of an afterthought. So man not only comes after as a long-time descendant of the animals, we see that qualitatively he's not unique. He's not any different. He's really just another kind of animal, according to evolution. And finally, evolution is a purposeless process by its definition. So it would say that man really has no particular purpose. And so in the end, I think that when we look at theistic evolution as it tries to marry God, with a purposeless process, it's really trying to bring about a marriage of a purposive God, of marrying purpose with a purposeless process. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how different. They're very different. So hopefully that will sort of put that in perspective. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Umber.
Okay, there's one last point that I wanted to make real quick, and that has to do with the unintended consequences of integrating evolutionary theory with Christianity. And that is that all the prominent theistic evolutionists whose books we've read, whose lectures we've listened to, whose articles we've read, every single one of these prominent ones, at least that we've come across, claim that mutation and natural selection are adequate to explain the origin and development of life on Earth. Now, keep in mind they do this in the context of saying that God started the universe with certain natural laws that are capable of producing life, or at least helping life diversify. Or they say that God is working behind the scenes in some undetectable way, so that it appears that it's all happening through natural selection and mutation, but he is there somewhere in some undetectable way. Or what's more common is most theistic evolutionists, at least from what we've seen, seem to refuse to posit any specific way that God uses evolution. But either way, one way or another, they are at least claiming that it appears the natural forces are adequate to explain the origin and development of life on Earth. And if you think about it, this is an odd position for a theist to take, especially a Christian. I mean, I just have an illustration for you guys, and I owe all credit to Christian philosopher Greg Koukl for this illustration. It's a fantastic illustration. But what if you were to come up to me and say, how do you boil water? And I think about it for a second. I say, oh, that's easy. If you're at sea level, which we're in Phoenix, we're about at sea level, and you take an open flame, like a Bunsen burner or a campfire or something like that, you get it going. And then you take a large metal pot and you fill it with water. Then you simply put that directly over the flame so that the water is heating up quickly. You throw in a leprechaun, and when it reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit, it'll boil. And you say, did you say leprechaun? Well, yeah. As the water's heating up, you throw in a leprechaun, and it reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit, it'll boil. You say, wait a minute. Do you need the leprechaun for it to boil? I mean, if you don't throw the leprechaun in, will the water still boil? And you think about it. I think about it for a second. I go, yeah, it should still boil. And of course you say, well, then let's leave the leprechaun out. Who needs the leprechaun, right? It's superfluous. Well, similarly, with this understanding of evolution, God becomes superfluous. And really, this shouldn't be any surprise to us, because the theory of evolution was developed as a God substitute. It was intended to explain the development of life on earth apart from special creation, in place of special creation. See, if nature is selecting, God is not selecting. So with that, we wanted to leave plenty of time for Q&A because this is a huge subject. It touches on a lot of other subjects that are very big. So let's go ahead and open it up for any questions, comments, concerns, proposals. So yeah, any questions?
Here, Marty, I'll give you a mic too. Yeah, we wanted to leave this time at the end to really have an open discussion. So there's a lot of things they didn't discuss, but we can do it here. And Marty and James are really good dialogue partners, so we really want any questions to be asked at this time. So Marty, you now have your own mic.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that in reality that this theory of evolution was created to be counterproductive to the Christian's belief of God, but at the same time there are people who want to mix the two and say that, yeah, it is God, but God works through everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to realize that it wasn't intended to be counterproductive to belief in God. It was intended to replace special creation. So Darwin, for most of his life, and it appears that all of his life, he was a theist. He at least believed in God. Whether he was a Christian, it looks like later in his life he actually rejected certain aspects of Christianity. But he certainly attended a Christian church. His family, at least by tradition, he was a Christian. So he probably would have referred to himself as Christian. I think he did on several occasions. But he was writing at a time when science was intended to be a way of explaining things apart from miracles. And so at that time, the understanding, he's called a naturalist. You often hear people refer to Darwin as the naturalist. Well, what that means is explaining things through natural laws and not through any sort of special creation. And so his theory was intended to replace the understanding that God created the different kinds as separate kinds. And so he would say that life began as one life or just a small group of lives, and then evolved from there, and it was actually, he described it as a big branching tree pattern. So he did contradict the Bible, we would say, in that regard. Yeah, and in fact, the effect of it is it ends up becoming a God substitute. So not that was necessarily his original intention, but it does end up replacing God. And what's the point of leaving God in the picture if you already have an explanation without him?
I think it's interesting to note that much of what Charles Darwin thought was based on a prior idea. And the prior idea that it was built on, most of it was built on, was the work of Charles Lyell and his work on geology, because Darwin had read this, and I believe even brought this with him on the Beagle when he went on this voyage. So he already had in his mind this concept of long, slow, gradual processes of Earth history, which was already shaping his thinking in that direction. It's interesting to note that in Charles Lyell's writing, the one who was most famous for the idea of the slow, gradual processes of Earth history laying down over long ages of time, Lyell very specifically said at one point in his writing that he had hoped to get rid of Moses. So he was making the point that it really was Lyell's intent, at least that's what he said, that he was hoping to get rid of Moses, in other words, Genesis.
You've got to have questions. We've touched on age of the earth, we've touched on evolution. Yes, good.
Age of the earth, I agree with all that you have said. My hang-up has always been, well, why the appearance or supposed appearance of an old universe, particularly starlight time.
Right.
That's you know, I've heard he made Adam fully mature, he's made the universe fully mature, but why, if it is a young Earth, does it, looking at Adam at 25 years old, why does the universe, if we go by starlight time, look like 13 billion years old?
Right. Well, I think this is really important, and it ends up touching on several big issues. So let me first say that both of us are young Earth. We take a young Earth creationist position, but we have the utmost respect for old Earth creationists. In fact, I'm a big fan of a lot of the work of Hugh Ross and Dr. Fuzrana and these other great scientists that work for Reasons to Believe and other old Earth organizations. We disagree with them on several points, but we do appreciate the work that they do. And you can be, obviously there is a lot of disagreement within the Christian community about how that works out, but we can all come together on this issue that God is the one who created. And I think we do need to team up against this idea that's eroding Christianity and eroding people's belief, the idea that there is no need to have God involved in the whole thing. But with that said, we would actually say that the universe does not entirely give the appearance of age, of an old universe. We think that there have been arguments that have been made that are meant to support an old Earth, and that when you look at those particular areas of science, that particular study, yeah, it does seem pretty natural to draw the conclusion that the Earth is old. I think you can look at other aspects of each one of those questions, but there's other evidence that actually points to a young Earth and a young universe. But the starlight issue is certainly something we've discovered really since the time of Einstein, and a little bit earlier actually, that it does appear that it takes billions of years for that light to travel from the stars to the Earth. But the question that one young Earth astronomer asks, Dr. Russ Humphreys, when he says, you're saying it takes billions of years for the light to go from stars to Earth, whose clock are you using? And his point is that time is relative. Even you can do this experiment. Many of you have probably heard of this experiment. You can take a clock here on Earth. It has to be an atomic clock. It has to be a very accurate clock. You take a clock here on the surface of the Earth, and you can take a clock, and this has been done, into the space shuttle orbiting the Earth, and they run at different speeds. Since we're closer to the gravitational body, I think the one on Earth runs faster. The one in space actually runs slower. You see, time is dilated or stretched and affected by gravitation. And so there are theories that Dr. Russ Humphreys has put forth, that Andrew Carmelli, Dr. Andrew Carmelli, or Moshe Carmelli, others. Yeah, I should probably let you talk about that because you.
Well, I think one thing also to keep in mind, and this is by no means in any way meant to be disrespectful to those in astronomy and astrophysics, but I think that even they would admit that of all the sciences, just within the realm of sciences, that the astrophysics sciences, the sciences that are dealing with objects out there, you're going to, or those sciences are going to require the most amount of speculation simply by the fact that we don't have direct access. It's not like biology where you can dissect something and you have direct access to that. So when you're dealing with the sciences of astronomy, astrophysics, and cosmology, you are dealing with objects that we don't have direct access to, and all that to say, of all the sciences, it requires the greatest amount of speculation just by virtue of that. But to just give you a sample of an alternative view, what I think is just as plausible, Dr. John Hartnett with Creation Ministries International gives a talk on this where he does an interview, or he has, not an interview, but he had spoken to one of the most respected theoretical physicists in the world. His name is Moshe Carmelli. And Professor Carmelli, the long and short of it is that he said that he took Einstein's theory and he didn't change it, but he did, from what I understand, he did plug one more thing into it, and that was velocity. And I'm not going to even begin to pretend that I do not understand the computations, so don't even ask. But the long and short of it is that Dr. Carmelli, and they call it Carmelian physics, new physics, and what he says is this, when you take Einstein's theory, once you plug velocity into that equation, you end up with a better model of the origin of the universe. And even the Big Bang Theory, which does require a lot of patching, because there are a lot of inconsistencies, there are a lot of problems and anomalies that they've kind of had to patch. Well, maybe there's dark matter, maybe there's dark this and that. So they've had to invoke a lot of things to sort of patch up the theory. But they said that under Carmelian physics, all those problems go away. And the theory on the origin of the universe not only just is cleaned up very well, and a lot of those anomalies disappear, but he said it actually becomes possible for stars to actually be at that distance and that light having reached us in a very short amount of time. That's
relative to us.
It just, to give you one brief illustration of why he said that, you've probably seen on some of the science programs when they talk about time, they talk about gravity and how it works. You may have seen where they'll take a trampoline and they'll put a bowling ball in there and it kind of makes that little dent in it, and then they'll take a marble or a golf ball or something and they'll push it out there, and you'll notice that it goes around that trampoline because it's got that indentation. And so they talk about gravity's effect, and this is why it pulls the body around it. And Dr. Carmeli is saying that in his mind, he said the trampoline itself, the very fabric of space, is also in motion. So this is kind of what his theories are based on.
Yeah. What was his full name? Does he have a book?
I believe he does. His first name, I think, is Moshe, and I believe the last name is spelled Carmeli, Carmeli.
Did you have anything with the book?
I don't. Yeah.
But other physicists and cosmologists to look at would be Dr. Josh Hartnett. Is that?
Yeah, that would probably be John Hartnett.
John Hartnett, and then also Russ Humphreys.
Russ Humphreys.
I have Humphreys on Starlight Time.
Yeah.
And I think the presentation by John Hartnett, you'll find that with Creation Ministries International, and I think it's called Starlight in Time.
That's Russ Humphreys.
Yeah, it's spelled a different name, I guess.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I feel as a Christian, I mean, when I read the Bible, I don't actually take into consideration that when God did create the earth, that it happened in these several specific back-to-back days, because I feel reading in context to my Bible that it seems like one single day, but God he's immune to time. There's no time with him, you know what I mean? He is what he is, and I feel he is like immune to time. So I feel when they talk about those 7 days that it was a period over time, and I don't understand why somebody who could think that they are a Christian would try to say that evolution. It boggles me. Like.
Yeah, I can relate to being boggled by that. But with regard to the concern about time, I think you're right that if God is the only personality we're considering, to him, whether it's a day or 1,000 years, like we find in Scripture, it's no difference to him. But there are those of us involved as well. And I think once we bring in the communication from Scripture, that it's intended for us to understand, and that it seems to be explicit, and I think once we bring in those kinds of issues, then we see that regardless of how God views time, he's communicated certain specifics to us, and I don't see any good reason to question those specifics, especially in light of the recent scientific discoveries that are really throwing a big wrench into some of the dating methods that were used to determine that the Earth is billions of years old. I mean, here's one just something to consider, and I certainly respect anyone from an old Earth perspective, and there's certainly a lot of evidence that an old Earth person can throw back at me. So this is not intended to trump the whole argument, but just something to consider. I'm trying to think of her name. I'll think of her name in just a second. There's a paleontologist. She also has a background in microbiology, who was involved in the discovery. She wasn't the initial discoverer, but she was involved in the discovery of a T-Rex fossil in Montana. Mary Schweitzer, thank you. In the Hell Creek Formation. Yeah, the Hell Creek Formation, which is a sandstone formation in Montana. And it's a fossil graveyard. I mean, there are just tons of dinosaur fossils there. But they uncovered this T-Rex fossil, and the thing was too big to airlift. And so they couldn't move it as a continuous fossil, so they had to break it at some point. And so the femur is the largest bone, easy to break. It doesn't end up affecting the joints, if you break it right in the middle. We also have a lot of T-Rex femurs, that others have found. So that seemed like the best place to break it. They broke it there at the femur, and what they found was soft tissue, connective tissue, blood vessels, even some blood proteins. And what's amazing with this connective tissue is that Mary Schweitzer took it back to her lab. She took great care in preserving the specimen so it wasn't contaminated. They've done tests since then to make sure it wasn't contaminated. It's amazing. People keep questioning whether it was contaminated, and the tests that they've thrown at this are incredible. And still, it keeps coming back that it wasn't contaminated. But anyway, she took it back to her lab, dissolved the bone matrix around it, and the connective tissue was still stretchy. You could pull it to almost twice its length and let go, and it snapped back to its original length. And this is supposed to be 65 million years old, and yet it's still stretchy, and it's still preserved. And they've done tests on it to make sure that it is actually the blood proteins, and it creates an immune response. I mean, so it has to be like the exact right protein to do that. Sure enough, this was from the T-Rex. This is still soft tissue from the T-Rex. And since then, other soft tissue has been found. People just never thought to actually look for soft tissue in a fossil before. In fact, when Mary Schweitzer showed up on the site there at Hell Creek, she asked the question, she got off the helicopter or plane or whatever it was. She got out and she said, "It smells like rotting carcasses around here." And they said, "Oh yeah, all the Hell Creek fossils smell that way." And she thought, well, how come no one has put two and two together? That, clearly you have decomposing soft matter here. But no one ever even thought to question that. And since then, there have been other dinosaurs, fossils where they found soft tissue, and it continues to be well preserved. And keep in mind, sandstone, where this fossil was found, is the most porous of all the matrix that it could have been in. Just about the most porous. And so that means water, oxygen, other things that decompose soft tissue very quickly were all running fairly easily through the sandstone.
I think as we think about long ages for the Earth, one thing to consider, and I can't really think of a better way to sort of summarize it and to picture it, as did the speakers that are actually at our church this weekend. And they said that of all the visuals, they use a lot of slides. They got a great slide presentation. And of all the slides that they put up, the one that they seem to get the most reaction, where people the light just really comes on, is they have a visual that shows Adam and Eve, shows the animals in the Garden of Eden, and it says, "And on the sixth day God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good." And they're saying to each other, "Yeah, this is very good." And then as that image, you're kind of pulled back away from that image, and now you see underneath this, it's almost like a little island, underneath this Eden, where they're saying that this is very good creation. You see it's actually on top of this long pile, this enormous pile of death and decay that came for over this long period of time leading up to them. And when you look at that and you think, man, would God look back on 10 to 15, well, of course, you're just counting just life here on earth at this point, but would he look back at this long history of death, destruction, disease, pain and suffering, which eventually, at least by an evolutionary view, which would eventually lead to the first man and woman that we're recognizing, and then to say everything that I've created is very good? There's something that just doesn't add up.
Yeah, and keep in mind that this view of theistic evolution is quite common in seminaries. This book here, Already Compromised, is a fantastic book because it's actually the bulk of the material in the book was done by a market researcher who surveyed and was very careful in the way that he surveyed, but he surveyed seminaries across the United States. And what he determined is that theistic evolution is being taught in a large number of Christian seminaries across the United States.
By the way, one thing I didn't mention, I was going to keep it brief on the summary to give us question and answer time, but sometimes the question comes up that in the chronology given in Genesis, if you have an earth right from the start, and you have day and night, obviously you do. There's day 1, day 2, and that's another hint that we're dealing with a certain amount of time. There's evening and morning the first day, and people have asked, well, how do you have day and night cycles, and yet the sun, you said, well, Genesis is not created until day 4. And but if you look right in those first couple verses of Genesis, that God creates light. He doesn't tell us specifically what the light source is, but there is a source of light. So even from day 1, you have an earth that's in rotation. You have a source of light. And so you're having at least day and night cycles that are taking place. So why did he wait until day 4? As we look through history, we look at some of the mythologies. Most of them, at least many of them, begin or involve the worship of the sun as the giver of life, where a lot of cultures deified the sun and worshiped the sun. And it's almost as if God is saying, I'm going to make it known for all of time that I'm the one who gives life, not the sun. I'm the one who gives life. And so he's the one who gives life right from the beginning. And the sun that other cultures try to deify, God has recorded this later in history that this is something he created later.
Yeah, you brought that up. And that ancient Near Eastern, that's the context that Genesis is written in and that the Hebrews are functioning in. It's called ancient Near Eastern societies or cultures. They're cosmogonies. They're like discussion of what's up there and how it came about and all that kind of stuff. They didn't have these, even the creation account is markedly different, and where you have God, it's, the Christian doctrine is creatio ex nihilo, everything out of nothing. It's just God is by divine fiat, by creative power, creating things that now are, that were not. Whereas in these other creation accounts and comparative myths, Israelites' cultural neighbors, they always have something existing before already. So there's the sky, the God is fighting in the sky, one God cuts the other God in half, and out of the God's innards that spills creates the earth. And there's all these kinds of different versions that are like that, but there's stuff already there. And almost always the creation is out of like some kind of chaos or something like that, usually involving the sea. And you look, and then you look at this Israelite discussion of origins, and it's radically different. Obviously, they're still speaking a Semitic language. They're still ancient peoples, but the whole like framework, the whole worldview of it is different in who God is, how things are coming about, all of that, and the discussion of the sun. This is why I wanted to make a comment real quick. Is so important because, for example, the Egyptians, who the Israelites were suppressed under, sun god Ra was supreme in their pantheon, and the Pharaoh is supposed to be like an embodiment of that, and he preserves Ma'at, they would call it, which is order, and a big part of that is the sun every time rising up. It shows that Ra and vicariously Pharaoh are constantly battling and becoming victorious over the dark powers so the sun can rise every morning, which, by the way, in those plagues against Egypt, you see God saying, no, that's not how things work. The Aztecs sacrificing people so the sun can come up, and all this stuff. God doesn't even use the sort of standard Hebraic words in Genesis. He calls it the greater light and the lesser light. It's like he doesn't even want to call it by name, so there's no way there can be like these pagan associations or identifications, even with the names of what he's using. He's waiting until the fourth day to have the sun, and then he's saying it's the greater light. And then the moon and all that stuff, the lesser light. So everything about it, it's still historical narrative, but there's also, if you want to, a polemical aspect that says, it's almost like an apologetic against all of Israel's surrounding neighbors and their origins, their myths of origin. So the funny thing is, we can look at those and they're so clearly far afield, they could never match up with anything moderately scientific in the modern era. We look at Genesis and we see all these things that could line up, even though they're described in sort of phenomenological language, meaning everyday parlance. We see this actually matches what we see about reality, and it doesn't have all the telltale marks of all the idolatry and paganism and nature worship. There's something very different about this because God is telling us what he did. So to make a comment, because that sun thing in the fourth day is really big to really frame the larger question of what is going on in Genesis.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Sorry about the long comment. That wasn't really
that's good. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that I was kind of curious about with the young Earth, if you look at, and you guys mentioned velocity being put back into time. If you're doing that, you're still drawing it into a singular point, a singular creation,
Right.
which I think they've done that math, and I think that's usually where they get that 13 billion years. But that very first day is of expansion of time and space fabric expanding is millions and millions and millions of years, our time. Our 24 hours, when you're talking about the first existence of time, I guess,
Right.
is millions and millions of years. So, I guess it's a matter of perspective when you're looking at, if you're outside of that and you're looking at 24 hours now, our days, that 24 hours when time is created, looks very, very different. And I don't know if they've done any, and then the second day would be, quite a bit smaller. The third day would be quite a bit smaller. But your first few days are millions, if not billions, of years.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that with our understanding of how the expansion rate works, those first few days would be millions or billions of years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple things worth considering
of our 24-hour time now, because obviously in time it would be expanding, but if time is at a singular point and no time is passing,
right,
and it's expanding at the speed of light, your first day, relative to today's 24 hours is billions of years.
Do we know that there was no Earth when the singularity for the rest of the universe happened?
I don't think there needs to be, even to create on the first day.
Right.
I mean, I think it could actually, if you look at, Big Bang Theory, I think it could still be in that time frame.
But what I'm asking is, it seems like we're assuming that it all happened based on the standard theory that not only does everything go back to a singularity, but that Earth was a part of that singularity, and that the Earth came about through the singularity and the expansion of the singularity. So I guess what I'm saying is
it would make sense for that to have to happen before, obviously if that creates all matter, it would create time. You couldn't have an Earth that would be acted upon in time before that.
I guess
so you couldn't have it before, no.
What I'm saying is if God, it's certainly possible, at least possible, that God could quickly expand the singularity and form the Earth right there in the process of doing that, form the Earth right there in the matrix of everything else. All within...
So and that's what's happening even now. You're looking at Einstein's theory, you're looking at still an expansion.
Well, based on an inflation model.
Expanding at the speed of light, right?
Based on an inflation model, but I don't see any constraint where God couldn't just, spread it out even faster.
Well, if it's, it's fairly constant now, I think, and that's why we
Yes, I agree. But I'm saying in the past, if we extrapolate from the current expansion rate back, we get a certain age. But that's a lot of assumptions.
I don't think you'd even need to do that. I think you're even further complicating it. I think you're still in that time frame where you'd be able to create the Earth and still be in the time frame where it would make sense scientifically and theologically.
I think the other thing that we need to consider is that when we talk about based on our clocks here on Earth, that is going to be different than, well, first of all, those clocks would change a lot, even if you're talking about an evolutionary expansion, an inflation model. Even then, the rate at which time works is going to depend a lot on the physical theories that we talked about earlier, and gravitational bodies, and I'm not quite sure how velocity affects that, but either way, whether it's a singularity or it's expanded, or moments after the expansion starts, if it's in velocity, if it's moving or rotating or something like that, I'm not quite sure, but it seems like that would have a significant effect on how we view the timeline. But either way, there's a lot of assumptions, is what I'm trying to say. And so the clock here on Earth is based on an Earth already in place and certain gravitational bodies already in place a certain distance away and a certain mass to the Earth and all of that, which if we're talking about the original expansion and how and what method God used to do that.
You're not really having that anyways, because he hasn't created the sun until the fourth day. So
right.
That already can't be part of it. It already has to be outside of that. So if you're talking about 24 hours and you want to hold to a 24-hour day,
right,
you're still, as long as you're talking about singularity and then expansion, you're still talking about millions or billions of years.
I don't see how it necessarily has to be millions and billions of years.
Well, if you're looking at
I think on that, and I could be wrong, it's been a while since I watched that presentation by Dr. Hartnett, but I think he does explain that. It seems like he does mention that there's an acceleration at the initiation of the event, and then it reaches a point to where it is sort of, it seems like it does reach a point after that acceleration that it does.
Well, it would, your first day would be obviously the longest because it would be the expanding the most. And if you're expanding out in a sphere, just like you're blowing up a balloon, your first breath gets the, whereas if you've already got this huge balloon, your next breath is very, very minute. So you're still talking about the same thing. Each, if you're looking at every day being a breath into a balloon, say for instance, your first breath is a huge thing compared to 13.6 billion years of breaths into the same balloon. That would be, immense.
Yeah.
But, like I said, you extrapolate that back, and that's how they're getting their age anyways. And I think if you are looking at a 7-day period, I think it fits right there with the, most Big Bang Theory anyways.
Well, I wish I could give a better, and I'm not able to give the presentation the way that Dr. Hartnett gives it, and maybe that might be helpful. I think he does cover that. It might make more
Can I share one thing, and then maybe that will be probably our last question, because it relates to this. That's why I want to make sure we get to them. But however way we go with this, I wanted to try to have, because how many of us can become astrophysicists, but did God intend it to where only an astrophysicist could read Genesis and understand what's going on? So as we consider that, even sort of what we might call commentary on Genesis, I think helps us inform what we should be. It helps give us a tighter interpretive lens. So this is a really good passage, I think. I want people to consider as we consider Genesis, because it relates to something key that happens in Exodus. So in Exodus chapter 20, let me read. This is part of the Ten Commandments that Yahweh gives to Moses. Here's what he says in Exodus 20, beginning in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, or your son, or your servant, or your male servant, or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. So that the commandment is Sabbath keeping, which is really like besides circumcision, this key thing of what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be a follower of Judaism, to be in the covenant with Yahweh. It's this key thing. But God doesn't do this with all the commands, but he gives this further sort of rationale that's almost saying, in this way you imitate me. Because the very next verse, and this is the key verse, Exodus 20:11 says, For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Just to see, it's saying, you do this, here's your week, because here's what I did. In 6 days I made everything, and then now I'm resting. So we have to have some kind of actual connection, I think, for this to have any kind of logical coherence. Whichever way we sort of say, here's where I fall. For a Christian of the high view of Scripture, we should really make sure legitimate textual considerations are informing where we are willing to go and not go. But I think maybe one more question. I think
I'll just quickly say that it's not just a starlight issue. There there are a lot of other indicators that even things further out there in space are not as old as they thought, such as the cratering of the moon. There are many indicators, what they call ghost craters and things, that would indicate that the cratering happened very rapidly. They see planets that still, as we observe them now, they thought that they were billions of years old, and they're finding their magnetic field that should no longer be there. They're finding indication of volcanic activity that should no longer be going on. And so there are several. It's not just the starlight issue. There are a lot of indicators that seem problematic for an old universe. But.
Yeah, go ahead. You had your arm up for so long. I feel bad for you.
Because I have some friends that subscribe to theistic evolution, and they're Christians. I just ask them, well, why, when you read Genesis, like, why do you think it's not a literal 6 days? I mean, what do you get if you're reading this like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago? What would make you think that it's 4.6? Why would it make you think that 6 days is 6 billion years? Or like, what makes, you know what I mean? Like, what, like, how do you go about that? So, are you letting the scripture speak for itself, or are you getting the idea from somewhere else, like science and things? So, because science says a man can't resurrect from the grave, I mean, there's certain things that you take by faith, and but I was going to say that so like I think the burden wouldn't be on me, or I think they would have to explain it, and with that 6 day, because if God is sovereign, and they even said, yeah, well, we believe God is sovereign. I guess He could create it in 6 days, but we still subscribe. So I'm just like, okay. I mean, as long as our focus is the gospel is the main thing. But it's just, I want to know why. Why do you think that? Where are you getting that from?
Well, you raised two really important points. One is that, in fact, the gentleman that was speaking at our church this weekend, as I talked to him off to the side, he said that he's asked several people that are theistic evolutionists, he's asked them, if you read just Scripture and didn't let anything influence it, as you read Scripture, is there any possible way you would get from a straightforward reading of Scripture alone, would you ever get the indication? And of course they admit, no, there's nothing that would indicate that from Scripture. And he says, well, then what you're telling me is the only reason that you're getting this in the text is you're bringing an outside source. And then, as you said, if you're going to say, well, we're going to let science, and of course science, like everybody else, can be wrong and has been wrong about a lot of things. But if we're going to say, I believe that because we're taking outside information and we're bringing it to that from the sciences, then we're back to what you said. But the science also tells us that people don't rise from the dead. What does that do to the gospel? So if we read science and say science is the final word, then it runs into a problem with the gospel as well. And Jesus didn't rise from the dead because that's scientifically impossible.
And let me just say briefly, for those of you who do hold to an old earth, one things I do want to clarify is number one, we're saying that the arguments from the theistic evolutionists are weak, trying to interpret Genesis in the ways that they usually do to try to fit evolution in there. I think the arguments from the old earth, I have my concerns about that, and I want to talk to an old earther about how they interpret Yom and how they interpret Genesis, but I think it's much more respectable. So I'm not trying to lump the old earther in with the theistic evolutionist. I think we can have a very rich dialogue, old earth, young earth, but between the theistic evolutionist and any sort of creationist that questions evolution, I think it becomes that at least we come from the perspective of saying the arguments are very weak on the theistic evolution side from the text. I guess that I'll just stop there.
Hey, do you guys appreciate Marty and James coming down from the East Valley? I know I do. You guys, wonderful job. Brought out a lot of issues, and part of this is to begin to help us to think. No class answers every question, but we want to have people interacting with things maybe they haven't thought about before. And they have some good books up here, you can tell. So if you want to know more about this, they're sort of walking bibliographies on the topic. And definitely get with them. I think they've got a little time to hang out with us before we get out of here. I'm glad we were able to do this class. I think it went well, and we'll discuss more things like this. But these are not, I like the way they did it. And so I want to keep that attitude as we discuss this. We're not saying old earth folks aren't Christians. We're not saying anything like that. You could tell. We need to be able to talk about this. And there's the bigger issue. So sometimes the age issues get mixed up with the evolution issues. What we're really discussing is explicit evolution. That's the key thing that we're saying there's the challenge with. And we're not even saying that you cannot be a Christian if you believe in evolution. We're just saying there's big problems in our consistency when you do that. But praise God, we're not always consistent. So we hold evolution and we have this inconsistent belief with the Bible talking about a first Adam and a last Adam. And we have them in cognitive dissonance. But we want to smooth those out, don't we? We want to work on those. So that's what we're saying. So I hope we have that spirit and attitude as we discuss these things and can do it in a mature way that really honors what God has showed us and is really for our own sanctification and edification so we can appreciate Him more. Let me close in prayer. Thank you guys very much for setting the tone.